Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Nick from Tenacity.ai with my co-host Jason, and you're listening to the Cloud Cost Optimization Podcast. Today, we're going to discuss Chargeback and the importance of holding others accountable in your cloud environment, especially at scale. This could be Chargeback, Showback, billback, in other techniques there, but we want to dive into some of the strategies around why you do this, how you do this, what sort of things you would implement. So I guess Jason, off the top, just what are when we say chargeback, what are we really talking about here when it comes to the cloud providers?
Well, I think it's, chargeback, showback, billback. There's multitude of different terms, but I think at a high level, it's the ability to accurately allocate costs to the units in your business, which are contextual to you, right? So if I'm a service provider and I'm managing my public cloud environments for my customers, I may want to be able to accurately show how much they're spending so that I can invoice them and charge them whatever my fee is. For an organization, I think it could be, I have maybe I have it broken up by application, right? Different product owners, product groups. I might want to allocate that way. Or maybe it's just business unit functions like marketing, sales, things like that. You want to be able to show them what portion of the total cloud costs are associated with those particular units of measure, whatever is contextual to the business.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think we all sort of understand why, especially if we've been in IT or cloud for any period of time. We understand this idea of being a cost center and the importance of being able to show cost out and sort of defer some of that out to revenue aligned organizations or other organizations, period, because it stops a lot of that internal focus, or at least helps redirect a lot of that internal focus on cost cutting at a cost center, an IT department, and shifts the conversation to how are our technology costs aligned to our revenue, right? Because we, from a cloud cost management perspective, and really cost allocation and chargeback are a cost management discussion, to be clear. So this is one of the things you got to get right before you really focus on a lot of optimization. So the importance,
how do you know what to cut if you don't know where things are?
Exactly. Or should you cut it, right? Because if you can align costs out to your highest revenue growth item and those costs are skyrocketing, that may not be the thing I want to cut. It may be the thing I just want to manage, because depending on whether that's growing linearly or whether it's growing asymptotically, or hopefully not growing exponentially, because then you do have something to go fix. But the idea being that I don't want to just kind of blanket across the board start cutting things with a cleaver. I want to use a scalpel, and I need to first understand what I'm not going to touch or what I'm just going to focus on managing. I think that's a really important part of this topic.
Yeah, I think you kind of outlined the question you need to be able to answer before you can even do it, is how are these things growing, and then why are they growing that way, right? And so in the case of growing exponentially, like let's say it's revenue generating application that's growing exponentially, but also sales is growing exponentially, right? That could be a reason. And then maybe, well, wait a minute, my sales is growing exponentially, but we assumed that our IT spend would not grow at the same rate as that. So what's going on there? So just having the ability to answer that question gets you to a point where you can actually, accurately look at the business from a chargeback or showback or billback perspective. And I think the cloud is what's enabled us to do this, by the way. I mean, it wasn't, unless you were an organization that could afford to buy individual units of things for these different businesses, right? Like a VMware farm and SAN for marketing, or for whatever, product that you're talking about, and a different one here. trying to track all these things where you're not paying for things individually, right? In a legacy IT environment was very difficult to do. One of the benefits of the cloud is you can get pretty accurate down to the resource level on what these things are used. So as long as you have an accurate organization strategy, right? Like either by account or tag or whatever the case may be, you can really get down to some very accurate costs by these individual units.
Understanding that cost allocation is important. That's, we get that. And I think we all kind of understand that. But when we get down to actually how to do it, that's where when we are sitting across the table from a client, we're trying to help them take their environment and transform it into something that can be allocated. There's a handful of strategies there that we probably want to discuss. How do you actually implement this, and what are the sorts of issues that folks run into? So why don't we start there? What sorts of techniques are there for actually doing the cost allocation or splitting up the environment?
Well, I think probably the easiest method is by subscription or account or whatever logical way the provider gives you to separate groups of resources. So if I'm in Azure, a subscription by unit, right, could be an answer, whatever these units are. AWS could be account or accounts by unit. So I have a collection of accounts. I mean, to me, that's the easiest way because, then you can, because tagging everything in a similar manner can be very hard if you're not all code. and tagging is probably the best way to do it, but also not the easiest. And best is probably a difficult way to put it because I think you can achieve the same things by separating them by account or subscription. But tagging is the way to get the most detailed information, right? Down to the individual resource, like environment prod or business unit XYZ on every resource that's associated with that unit is probably the best way. But you can have a pretty good strategy just by separating these things by the logical units that the providers give you to separate them by, like account or subscription, et cetera.
Yeah, I agree. I think the account-based strategy for doing allocation is by far the simplest. It's the easiest for people to understand. Everybody understands when you say tagging. I think they immediately kind of go, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea. We should tag our environment." It's when you actually get down into the nitty gritty of, well, how am I going to tag all the resources? Which way? What are the keys that I need, and what are the values I'm going to key off of? That it can get really, really complicated, and it can drift out of control really fast. And that's why an account-based strategy is a really good first step. And then using tagging to refine that strategy, I think, is important. Should you have it?
Google calls them projects, but it's all the same. It's all the same concept: projects, subscriptions, accounts. Same concept, right? So I think those are, and they gave them. They have them organized in this way for specific reasons for you to do that, and that's how they recommend doing it as well now, is by that unit. We still recommend a solid tagging strategy, but separating by project, account, subscription is always a good thing to do.
So the question, of should you tag your environment, is yes, of course. I think it's harder to realize the future where it's a well-tagged environment than I think people understand when they embark on that. I think they really start to understand it down the road when they're a year or two in and they look at their tagging strategy and understand, we see this all the time, 40-50% of environments untagged, right?
Yeah. Which is why we give people a view to see their untagged resources because it's, just filter by untagged. Oh my gosh, I've got all these things untagged. So absolutely.
Yeah. Very early ask from our own customers. The difficulty here, or some of the hangups that folks run into, and I'm sure that folks listening to the show have run into some of these as well. But one of the very earliest is actually, what do I do with share costs? And I think we've seen this in most sophisticated environments at even modest scale. There are a set of shared resources And there's also separately a set of kind of overhead where people don't understand really where it should be charged back to. But let's address first kind of the shared resources. What is it that, what's the strategy there? How do you tackle that?
Well, there's probably many different ways, but historically we would allocate a certain percentage to business units of those shared costs, or whatever units you're measuring by. I think shared costs are difficult, right? Because are you going to allocate them evenly? Are you going to allocate them, weighted? How are you going to allocate these shared costs to these different centers? But in general, I think if you need to allocate them, then assigning a specific percentage to, and however you come up with that math to these different things, is most likely the best way to do so.
I think so. I think, the ultimate place to arrive would be, what would be awesome, what was the dream, is that you could do some sort of utilization based allocation for shared resources. It's really, really, really hard to achieve, right? So oftentimes then a team who's thinking about that is thinking about actually a refactor, because they're going to have to find a way to tag those resources and use those resources only for that particular use, right? And so you kind of actually getting a little bit away from actually it being a shared model and really kind of refactoring it into a dedicated model. The next best thing you can do.
Refactoring is absolutely that's a great point. Refactoring so that it is isolated, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's kind of ultimately where you want to go. But there's a whole lot of shared resources you just don't want to address, right? There's some sort of common set of functionality in shared across your apps that you need, but you don't want to go spend a bunch of time or make a big investment there. Sort of the next best stab at it is actually the weighted allocation model of just trying to understand from a perspective of either spending or use, how should those shared out resources actually be divided up amongst the various units that use them. And then adopting a tagging model that will help you with that division. And, we've got a number, and we write about this. So we can certainly, if you have any questions about this, you can certainly reach out to us on LinkedIn or through our website, and we're happy to share what the tagging strategies are that we've used. But you can effectively use, key value pairs to, tell yourself where you want to share back those particular resources and how you want to divide those up, so you can consume those tags and actually divide those costs that way. And then I think that the really easy peanut butter method is just taking that they are in fact shared resources and then dividing them, anything that's been tag shared amongst those business units. I think that's kind of the ultimate place you want to get to the easiest way to implement it.
Yeah. The other thing I would say, Nick, just by knowing what your shared costs are can help you make that decision. Because here's the thing. Sometimes, it doesn't happen all the time, but sometimes when people understand what portion of their environment is quote unquote shared, they realize it's not that significant of a number to even worry about how, it's like, okay, this is not anything significant, so let's just allocate it evenly across because it's not changing the numbers by that much. I do think a lot of here's what we see a lot of. Shared costs are a concern. But if you look at it, a lot of companies don't know what their shared costs are. They just know they have a bunch of shared stuff out there, right? So they're concerned about making sure it gets allocated. But is it because they just don't know what the number is? Or is it because they really need to make sure that those shared costs get allocated? And so I think another thing is just knowing what your shared costs will help you make the right decision on whether it's peanut butter, whether it's weighted, whether I just go, okay, well, I'm just going to budget for this much shared cost. No, they're going to be there. They're going to grow by this much. And I'm not going to worry about charging all that stuff back because it just gets really complicated. Or I'm just going to add a service fee, right? I mean, there's so many ways just by having the data. There's so many different ways in which you could attack this problem. People have the same concern about data transfers. Like one of the things by the way, data transfers way down is like a major cost in cloud. I mean, I know people think it's a huge cost, but if you look at like the top 5 services, data transfer isn't in there. Everybody's worried about data transfer costs, and it's usually because they just don't have the data around it to be able to make the right decision and understand it. So I think part of it is just knowing where those things are.
Well, I think you're right on the data transfer, and we'll do an episode on data transfer. Yeah, it's not a priority because it's so low down there. But
that's a link back in this article to the data transfer. Right, right. I just dropped that nugget.
The really important thing I think you hit on there is that knowledge is power here, and one of the realizations that I see happen is when they understand, when you do allocation. And the team now allocates out a bunch of resources and they have this chunk left, and it's this big chunk. A lot of times it's a big chunk. And they go, those are my shared costs. And we say, well, actually, let's identify the shared costs and then let's charge them back. And they find out that the shared costs are actually a very small chunk. And then the rest of what's left is this overhead where nobody knows where it's allocated or where it should go. That's a really good place to then go focus your time. You don't have to go focus on the business units you just allocated to. What you really need to do is focus on that overhead. Like what are all these S3 buckets, and why are there all these services that don't appear to be associated? They're associated to a project, right? Or they're associated to some other activity that happens either in the dev chain or in the business process that maybe we don't yet understand. So we're now trying to go allocate those. And if we can't allocate them, what do we do with them, right? Probably go through some sort of cost reduction exercise because we need to discover what they're used, how they're used. It's a really, cost allocation and chargeback is a really great way to get to what is my overhead that I can't allocate, and why is it that I can't allocate it? How do I attack that? And so I would really encourage folks to go through at least the high level cost allocation exercise, even if you're not going to really charge back your business units, to get to then what's left over and tackle that from a cost management and an optimization perspective if it's actually necessary in the environment. All right. Well, I think we're at 17 minutes, a little bit of a long show, so I think we're good for today. So that's all. Thanks everyone for tuning in, listening to the Cloud Cost Optimization podcast.